Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here as we all filter into the room. Just give folks a moment for their audio to connect and all those technological things that need to happen. We're really pleased that you could be with us tonight. Welcome again. My name is Gibson Fay LeBlanc, and on behalf of the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, we're so happy to host this event for Lee Sharkey and her luminous new book, final book. I will not name it except to say. I should say before we get too far that our friend Barbara Kelly is here tonight from Kelly's Books to Go and is selling copies of this gorgeous book. So we'll put that link in the chat in just a minute or two, and maybe a couple times as the night goes on. I also want to thank Martha Collins and Betsy Sholl for envisioning this, how this would go tonight, and for thinking of who the many, there's Lee touched so many people in her life in Maine in particular, and certainly beyond. But so just sort of figuring out how to gather a great group of folks to honor this book and to honor her. As most of you here likely know from your own personal experience, Lee Sharkey was a force of nature. She was a fierce poet and editor and teacher and activist, and her legacy in Maine lives on in all those arenas. It was early June 1975 when Lee and 6 other Maine writers signed the incorporation papers that founded the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance. And here we are thriving 46 years later, despite a pandemic, and helping to knit together Maine's writing and publishing communities. I should say also that founding group included Agnes, who's here with us tonight, and who'll be reading a poem later. And we were so pleased in 2016 to present Lee and Agnes together with our Distinguished Achievement Award. As Lee's book demonstrates so beautifully, Lee also loved ekphrastic poetry. And with the help of Phil Carlsen and Jeri Theriault, who are both here tonight as well, we'll be sharing poems. Artword, which is the partnership between MWPA and the Portland Museum of Art that Lee envisioned a number of years ago, continued this year and will continue for years to come in Lee's memory. This work and other programs that Lee loved will be helped along by more than $7,500 that people from around the country donated in her name to the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance. So we are profoundly grateful in so many ways for Lee's legacy. And as many of you also know, I'm sure, MWPA is one very small part of that legacy of Lee's story. There was her longtime teaching at the University of Maine at Farmington, her service as editor at Beloit Poetry Journal, where she read and edited with fervor and encouraged many young poets over the years, many poets of all ages over the years, as well as her political activism and so much more. So I'm going to start us off with a poem from Lee's collection before we hear from Martha Collins, Jeffrey Levine, and a wonderful group of readers. This is a poem, I believe it's the second poem in the book, Two-thirds of a couple. Two-thirds of a couple. A couple walks arm in arm with their ghost. A gust lifts it into the sky, where it's scoffed by a circling gull. The couple clings to the ghost's blue dress, which parachutes them slowly to the ground. I'm communing with ghosts today. They crown me with possibilities, the impossibly numinous. The blue dress lies shredded and bunched in a corner of the man's quiet skull. A quarter century has come to this. No pasaran. The man and the woman prove impossible to disentangle. The blue dress is becoming sky or river water. Puns leap from the man's mouth as the ghost works to stitch his lips together. Crowning the woman with memories, stitching the couple skin to skin. Before the ghost entered and stole the man's right mind, I came to the door labeled whatever is. I was hesitant to enter. Whether, whatever precious syllable. So with that, Martha Collins is going to say some things next.
Thank you, Gibson, and thank you, readers, and thank you all for being here. I'd like to say a little bit about how this book came to be. Late last summer, Lee Sharkey called to tell me she'd been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and had only months to live. Her son Jesse was with her at the time and would return from Chicago for long visits. But in the intervening weeks, I was with her, working almost constantly on the manuscript of the book we're honoring and reading from today. The poems were completed when Lee called, and I knew most of them. In recent years, we'd shared our poems, reading them aloud and commenting on them back and forth by phone or on visits between Massachusetts and Maine. But the sequencing of the book had only begun. The evening I arrived, Lee proposed that we begin work immediately by reading the poems to each other. The next day, we began early and worked late, and so it went for days. Reading poems aloud, discussing revisions, deleting poems, and most of all, finding an order. And then a title, and then notes. I'm still amazed at the energy that Lee mustered in these last weeks of her life. I remember well an evening when I was too tired to work and she was not ready to stop, and so we didn't. 10 days later, Lee mailed the manuscript to Tupelo, her press, for her previous 2 books. Within hours, her publisher, Jeffrey Levine, had enthusiastically accepted the book and asked if Lee had considered art for the cover. In the days that followed, we chose that art, sent unpublished poems to periodicals, asked for blurbs, and began to work with the press on publication details. Tupelo was working at breakneck speed to get at least the bound copy galleys into Lee's hands while she was still with us. That was not to be. The months she'd been promised turned out to be only 2. But she saw the designed book, including its lovely cover. I'll introduce Jeffrey Levine in a moment, but right now I'd like to say, on behalf of both Lee and myself, how deeply grateful we are to him for the extraordinary effort to get this book into print quickly. I'm also grateful to Christina Marie Darling and David Rossiter, Tupelo editors with whom I've worked in the last few months. Thank you all from both of us. To say that the weeks I spent with Lee were among the most meaningful of my life is to understate. I didn't know that 2 people could work together with such intense concentration, and I didn't know that 2 friends who'd known each other for years could become so close in the process. I'd like to now read a poem that I think reflects something of that process, though unintentionally and indirectly. Golem. My hands worked clay to fashion a golem. Truth, said my hands, and painted the word on his forehead. Breathe, said my hands, and he breathed. Speak, said my hands, and he spoke. Why, said my hands. Error, error, he stammered. Where? Asked my hands. In the loins, he answered. Hands, said my hand. He raised his hands. Hands, said my hand. He showed his long fingers. Fortissimo, piano, my hands said. He shouted. He whispered. Die, said my hands, erasing one letter. He shriveled and curled. Nesting, he wept, in your shoulder. And now I'd like to introduce Jeffrey Levine, founder and publisher of Tupelo Press.
Thank you so much, Martha, and thank you so much, Gibson. Martha is very modest. Martha shepherded all three of Lee's books that we published here at Tupelo, starting with Calendars of Fire, which was a gorgeous book in his own right, of course. Walking Backwards, just a few years ago, 3 years ago, and then I will not name it except to say, I've reached an age where there's just far too many goodbyes, but we all find ways of taking solace. And one of those ways is to look back on a very long and beautiful relationship with Lee. We met at the Warren Wilson Program for Writers many years ago. And though our meetings over the years, other than getting together over manuscripts, was sporadic, they were always so beatified. All of the times that I saw her at AWP, no matter how crowded the room, she would come running across the room, ply me with kisses and cookies. Best cookies you ever had. And for a writer who dedicated her writing life to writing the unsayable, these two aspects of her personality speak of beatification, of a light that those of us who were honored to know Lee were so lucky to share. Around her was this light, and if you were in her presence, you were bathed with it. There couldn't be a bigger honor in my life than to have found this extraordinary poet, this extraordinary woman, this fierce and beautiful poet, and to have had a hand in turning this art into these artifacts. It seems fitting and proper when we're saying goodbye to read the poem Breshit, which is the first reading of the year from the Torah, which is actually a beginning. It's a hello. It consists of Genesis 1 through 6, 8, in which God creates the heavens, the world, Adam and Eve, and the Sabbath. But of course, in the hands of Lee Sharkey, it becomes something much more glorified by her light in ways one could never expect. Breshit, in the beginning, in the beginning created God, with who at the end of the question, who is like unto you in glory, who being the name of the holy interrogative, first person inquisitive, the earth breathed eye and God unfolded in our throats, inner and audible word, himself mapping a plane that stretched to the end of the comprehensible. A physicist might love the Kabbalah, its black holes and emanations, its separations and convergences, its out of nothings, its onto nothings, through wormholes to the other side. My love, who once was out of nothing, something unfolding, no longer enjoys a paradox, a question whose answer is a question, folds back again to nothing, softly, like petals falling into the arms of the Shekinah. The beauty who has lost her eyes in a city where something was coming to nothing. A man sat among the old souk's bright woven textiles. He asked me, who will give us names? His people call themselves the humans of the lost city. A question that leads to a question. Thank you, and now I give you back to Gibson.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you for that. We will now be hearing from a number of folks, all reading from Lee's book, and I'm just going to tell you who you'll be hearing and which poems, and then we'll get into that. So first up, we will have Phil Carlsen reading House of Sorrow, Vessel of Anarchy, followed by Glenn Morazzini reading the title poem, I Will Not Name It Except to Say. Betsy Sholl will read What is Lost. Kathleen Miller will read Kollwitz, The Work. Natasha Mayers will read, I think, Concertina Wire, or perhaps What the News Won't Tell. Stuart Kestenbaum will read, and this is one that I can never say, Tosh Leach. Oh, I'm sure I butchered it. Sorry, Lee. Lee would tell. Lee, I can hear Lee telling me how to say it in my ear right now. Peggy Yocum will read Cloth. Jeri Theriault will read Fedora. Agnes Bushell will read Burn, and Kiran Kapoor will read Grief. Thank you all again for being here, and without further ado, Phil Carlsen.
Thanks, Gibson. It's an honor to be here with you all. The poems in the first section of the book have primarily to do with Lee's husband, Al Bursbach, who I knew for many years, going back to the 80s when he was on the search committee that brought me to Maine. And the poems not only deal with Al, but with the Alzheimer's that afflicted him in his final years. He played the cello, and we found that as words left him and that he was unable to express himself through language, he continued to be able to express himself through the cello. My wife, Jeri, and I went and had lunch with Lee and Al at his memory care facility, and got to see his room there and hear him play cello. And I'd like to read a poem now that is set in that room, is about the room, but is also about, of course, the relationship between two people who loved one another very much. The poem is called House of Sorrow, Vessel of Anarchy. Once I made a box to put a man in. I hung photographs of Earth from space and galaxies birthing planets. I cut a window on a garden that drew songbirds. I looked around and it was good. I picked the man up with tweezers, dropped him in. He rolled off the bed and spilled onto the rug. Words fell from him. He failed to gather them. He tried the locks, they would not open. His cell phone fell and cracked. I swallowed a shrinking pill and parachuted in. Small pearls welled in his eyes for me to wipe away. Lie down beside me, I offered. The bed was narrow. A cello touched us, skin to skin. And now, Glenn Morazzini.
And mute myself. Okay. Thank you to the organizers, the readers, the listeners, and to Lee. I was in Lee's last writing group, and prior to that, I had the pleasure of hanging out with Lee for a couple of years. We'd get together every couple of weeks, exchange poems, and sometimes we would just be together, have coffee, go out to eat. I chose this poem, it's the last poem she shared when the two of us were together. And my response was, I wouldn't touch it, it's beautiful. And I chose it for its prayerful optimism. I will not name it except to say that this has happened, is happening. We read each other as lines slip down the page. More than the cardinal's call is how she flicks her tail. We have owned little, loved much. We made our hearts a heart with many rooms. We read, we write, we do language. This is how, a mentor tells me, civilizations heal. Daylily pollen seduces by the door. Our children shall feast on the property of heaven. Thank you. Betsy Sholl's reading next.
All right. Thank you. I lost my mouse for a minute. I admired Lee for many things, for the warmth and generosity of her friendship, for her activism, for her wonderful, astonishing poems. We shared several things, being women of a certain age, and we especially shared the grief and caretaking of our two beloved husbands, both of whom had Alzheimer's, and watching Lee care for Al and just grow so much in kindness to us all was a great privilege. So I also chose a poem from that section of the book, What is Lost. He can no longer fit the corner of the sheet to the corner of the mattress. Here, tuck it in at the bottom and tuck the sheet in at the bottom of the bed. He stands with towels in his arms while spilled detergent spreads across the bedroom floor. The parts fall off. What is he? Is he the man he was? What do I want? A serviceable heart. How do I get there? Every day. A friend tells this story. A stranger appears in a bank. He rents a safe deposit box, but never returns. The bank has the box drilled open. Inside, only a notebook, every one of its pages blank. Where do I go? I come and go. What do I dream? Joy wide as a meadow. My lover returned to me, pierced by 6 arrows. Can no longer compose a thought into a clear sentence. Invisible, inaudible, want gives forth a wanting. Crossing through danger, the language itself is damaged. An orphan lies white-lipped and silent in her bed. 5 times a day, his mother would call and ask the same question. 5 times a day, he patiently answered. The script never varied. Each time was the first. Can love play the swan on the cello, enter each day without fear or resentment, laugh at the punster his mind has become, weigh his existence against the expanse of the cosmos. The next reader is Kathleen Miller.
Thank you for having me, and I'm really honored to be included in this group of people who knew Lee and loved her so well. I can't remember when I met Lee first, but what I take from my times of knowing her, she's a person who immediately my heart connected to. She just was such a magnetic person, and I feel really blessed to have shared space with her. And I also feel really honored that she decided to give her papers to the Maine Women Writers Collection, where I have been the curator, and that I was able to shepherd that process, partially while she was alive and then with Martha. So I'll be reading Calvet's The Work. Her self-made man, a brute beast crawling, hauling a weighty sky. Her self-made woman, legs splayed, body laid down among the cabbages. Her self-made peasants armed with scythes and pitchforks, hurtling to the fight. Her self-made peasants bound and penned, heads bowed, broad shoulders useless. Her self-made faces combed by dark, herself etched stroke by stroke, herself a sketch, a sleeve, a cloak, a hand, a paw, a nose, a nostril, herself a skull, almost a jaw, an absent mouth, herself drawn smoke. And I chose this in part because Colwitz is one of my favorite artists too. Next up is Natasha Mayers.
Hello, I'm reading What the News Won't Tell. I chose this poem because Lee could have been the heroine in this poem. It's for Sachita Israeleva. How when the general of the occupying army determined to kill the city, he began by visiting the public library. He climbed the broad stone steps, pulled the heavy library door open, breathed the distilled library air just like a reader, walked quietly up to the front desk, asked a few questions about the collection, and suggested somewhat intimately that, given the situation, it would be best that the library closed for a while. What the news won't tell is how, in the chill of his departure, the head librarian called the staff together, how they decided to go on threading their way through the dangerous streets and up the exposed steps to the library door so people could keep on reading, and how each day each of them summoned the courage to cross her threshold, how even after the demolitions began, even on the day the invaders assassinated one of them, and they cried out her name and fell into each other's arms, in the diluted light through the library windows, they determined to continue. How in the evenings, the head librarian made the rounds of her neighbors' houses, collecting books to bring to the relative safety of the library building to keep the people's memory alive. How when the aerial bombardment began in earnest, they formed brigades to ferry books to the shelter of the basement, and how the head librarian held Garcia Lorca in her arms, and he sang to her, and Anna Akhmatova leveled her gaze and emboldened her as the invaders destroyed 10 million books, whatever their bombs could touch. Lee and I were both actively involved in peace and justice campaigns for many years, but what brought us even closer was the work we did for decades. Lee taught for about 30 years, I for about
Unmute, Natasha. You're muted.
Was I muted the whole time?
Just a little bit at the end.
Oh, should I start did you hear me say that what brought,
Go back there.
okay, what brought Lee and me together even closer than our peace and justice work was the work we did for decades at Link Social Club, which supports the mental health of its members. I taught art and Lee taught writing. She taught for about 30 years. I taught for about almost 49 years, I think. And I've always said that work is what keeps me honest as an artist. And I wanted to share with you something that Lee wrote about her work with these wonderful people that we worked with for many years. They remind me that the essential function of art is to touch those places in which we are most private and most vulnerable and link them into the human chain. They remind us, and we all need reminding, that life's most important events occur when one human being encounters another, stripped of roles, stripped of weapons, and in one language or another, speaks. Thank you. I'd like to turn this over now to Stu Kestenbaum.
Thanks, thanks, Natasha. The poem that I'm going to read is called Tashlich, and the word is a Hebrew word, and it means to cast out. And on the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, as a part of turning toward the divine, of repenting. The custom is to take bread and throw it in the water where the fish come and swallow it up. In that way, your sins symbolically are gone. Lee had such an intensity, and I think Judaic sensibility in her sense of the concept of tikkun olam, to repair the world. I think that's evident in all of her work. The last line of the poem contains two words, one word in Hebrew repeated twice, and that is ruach, which means spirit, but it also means breath. And it also is the root of the word baruch, which means to bless. So it's all, the blessing, the spirit are all in the breath. Tashlich. I kneaded a loaf of my failings and fed it to the fish. I woke. Something was golden and riding the wind. Either it was small and close, or it was large and distant. Maybe a spider dancing on a thread. Maybe a leaf in a languid loop-de-loop. I was drawn to enter. For a moment, I had the integrity of an envelope. For a moment, I was a bush flowered with bees, of beaver ponds stilled I. Then winds swept in a tunnel where leaves came tumbling, first gold, then terracotta. One step, another. One mother's child, one father's darling following, bent-kneed, wind-combed. My friend says we are all strands in the web of life, ethereal beings waiting to taste the flowers. I have Jewish feet and a feet on the ground stubbornness. I'm not much for such vocabularies. Where I came from, who ever heard of an afterlife? But mother said spoon, and I said spoon. Mother said, don't touch the filthy ashtray, and I said, here, mommy, filthy ashtray, mommy, said don't touch. Words travel through pitch dark centuries to touch my recalcitrant body. Ruach, they say, and I say, ruach. Peggy Yocum is next.
Lovely to be with you all this evening. It's lovely to think of Lee, our friendship, our walks in her Vienna woods, and the poetry group that she gathered together in Farmington, Maine. I think of Lee and how she knew the sacredness of small things, which is what drew me to her poem, Cloth. Cloth. A figure bends over a table, spreading out a cloth. The cloth floats for a moment before it settles, a practiced tug to straighten it. Palms run over it. It doesn't matter who the woman was. You could take her form as others have done before. I could spend my childhood watching her, planting a harvest of women, all of us watching the cloth float down to the table, the sheet float down to the bed, the wings spread before landing, the wings spread before landing. I remember watching you. Our next reader is Jeri Theriault.
Hello. Of course, as a poet in Maine, I knew Lee and she knew me. We were acquaintances. It wasn't until I married Phil Carlsen about 7 years ago that our acquaintanceship blossomed into friendship, and I got to know her much better. And the poem that I chose to read is Fedora. I love how the object, the hat, is a portrait not only of the father, but of the father and daughter relationship. fedora. Every day, the father lifted it from the closet shelf. The ritual attached itself to the girl's sense of mourning, crowning the mysteries of dress and grooming. The father fierce and tall as a giant. The house kept its doors closed to the stranger. The father tiptoed across the floor. Every morning, the clock hands began the same passage. The father shaped the fedora precisely as he liked it. The father knew little of its history, not the felt maker, not the beaver in its underwater cavern, not the formidable Sarah Bernhardt as Fedora or her androgynous Hamlet. Once a father stepped to a beveled mirror, straightened his scarf, buttoned his overcoat with pink fingertips, adjusted a fedora's brim, a rare, sensuous gesture to console himself. He ran thumb and fingertips over the felted fur, tugged on his leather gloves and pocketed his keys, stepped out into the weather, slid carefully into the driver's seat of his DeSoto so as not to dent the crown. For he was meticulous, incurious, obsessive, tight-lipped, for he erupted when the girl defied him, for the depression was a black cape dragging behind him, the Shoah, a ghost sea troubling the shore, and the fedora kept its secrets. And the next reader is Agnes Bushell.
Thanks, everybody. I'm really happy to be here and to be able to read a poem of Lee's. I worked with Lee in 1975 to start the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance. We were crazy, radical hippies who had come to Maine and decided to become poets. We needed to have an organization that would represent us, and we felt the need to get together and bring this thing into the world. That was 1975. And then I didn't actually see Lee for about 40 years after that. She was in Skowhegan, I was in Portland. And it wasn't until the 40th anniversary of the founding of Maine Writers and Publishers that we saw each other again. And it was like we had never been separated. It was like we just had seen each other the day before. It was a really, really happy reunion. Then Lee was in Portland and we got to see each other quite a lot. And then in 2016, my son died. And I found that Lee was the person that I could speak to about that loss, and that she was able to meet me where I was, and speak to me out of her own grief. And we became very good friends. The last few times that I saw her, the last few weeks of her life, I asked her if I could use part of this poem that I'm going to read as an epigraph to the novel that I was about to publish, The Oracle Pool. And she agreed. And so her words are now in my book. And I feel that that brings us together in a very wonderful way. So I'm going to read Burn. Burn. I placed my hands beside each other, one palm down, one up. I closed and opened them like wind turning pages, as if I were the book I held when prophets railed and avarice rampaged. Like leaf fire dancing, all the shame, all the same, the many fire colors forked. I stood on the far side of the fire in the form of someone watching trees exploding, wedding rings melting, sheep's fur sizzling to sparks tossed skyward. The pages turned, Fireflies flashed in vanishing colonies. My hands turned frantically. An onslaught of concerns battered me. Wars, dumbstruck children, pills on the breakfast plate. The long sorrow that sets into my loved one's face when he stares into the absence that claims him. Then wind turned the page again. I remembered awe. Now the fire was a painting, the many colors of my own house burning, the stripes tightly woven, a coat of many colors to wrap myself in, nights in the desert. The red winds moved westward. The blues moved through me to become a sky. The next reader is Kiran Kapoor.
Thank you. I too am touched and honored to be here. I came to know Lee through the Beloit Poetry Journal, a publication she led and nurtured for decades. But of course, it wasn't just the journal that Lee nurtured. It was the poets she published, the editors she gathered and trained, and perhaps most importantly, a way of being that she suggested, both ruthlessly clear-eyed and supremely generous in reading, in writing, in editing, in all things. You'll see both those qualities in this poem. It's the last poem of Lee's book, and it speaks to what I think we're all feeling without her here. Grief. A coquettic woman shuffles into the infusion center on the arm of her son. A demented man floats through the memory center in a cone of silence. If every day I worship at the altar of my grief, who is it I'm true to? Father, mother, now another. I study the woman's bones and dark eye sockets and realize she's a mirror. I study my love's expression, looking to prize out what's inside. A fingertip touches my throat. We are grass in a windstorm. If someone touches my throat, if something breaks and smiles, offers the gift of tongues, if someone appears and averts the sacrifice, if someone dwells over the sick man's bed and slides into his body, if someone inscribes the commandments with a fingertip of fire, father, mother, and now another, grief is my sister and my brother. If a breeze stirs the sedge grass by the marsh, if a face arrives from the whirlwind calling itself indwelling, not through gloom, nor through sloth, nor through levity or idle chatter, if the Shekinah arrives and averts the sacrifice, if a wind with a face that speaks says, build my dwelling here, then I will remember joy. Then I will enter the sick man's body. Then I am a citizen of this republic. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiran, and thank you everybody for your beautiful readings. And I just want to say that we as an MWPA commissioned the Ascensius Press to, you're not going to be able to see this, but to do a letterpress edition of the poem that Kiran just read, and just in a very limited edition. We'll be sending those to all of our folks who are participating here tonight, and as well as a bunch of, I'm going to choose randomly some people in the audience to send them to too. So one might arrive, and if you're somebody who just needs to have one, you should just send me an email, and we'll make that happen. So we'd like to close out tonight we don't want to go too long, but we would like to give an opportunity for folks to say something. If you have something you need to say, share about one of Lee's poems or about a remembrance of her, we'd love to hear it. We just ask that you keep it brief so that we have time for whatever we need to have time for. And so if you'd like to do that, you can either wave a hand and just unmute yourself, or you can send a message in the chat, and I can call on you to speak up. So who would like to start us off with a remembrance or something of Lee, one of those poems?
I'm waving my hand over here, Gibson.
Oh, good. And I couldn't see you. Thank you.
Oh, that's okay. Hard to know what kind of screen you're looking at. Thank you, everyone, for gorgeous reading. And I wanted to share briefly that I got the best rejection letter of my life from Lee Sharkey. A short note that just set me on the right path with the poems that I'd sent into the journal that she didn't want. And I'll never forget it. It was professional, gracious, and very helpful poet to poet.
Wonderful. Thank you for saying that. And someone told me that Mark Solomon, there you are, Mark, go for it. Oh, looks like we can't hear you, Mark. Do you need to unmute? Nope, sorry. Looks like the audio is not working. Darn it. If you'd like to type something out into the chat, we could happily read that out. Sorry about that.
Oh, there you are.
Okay. Was somebody else speaking up? All right. Mark, do you want to try again? Somebody said that they could hear your audio there at the end. No. I don't think it's working. Yeah. Oh, well, alas. Technology. Betsy's going to speak up here.
Well, I was going to tell you that Glenn had his hand raised.
Oh, thank you for your help, Betsy. It's hard to see everybody out there. All right, Glenn, go for it. You're going to have to unmute.
Okay. Am I unmuted now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I have a just short little vignette that Lee and I both had just been in Unoaks and come back, and I was in her house, her little study. We're sitting on the same couch, and she sent me Letter to Al, that terrific poem. And Lee is on my left, and me and my narcissism had about 900 suggestions, and I was going right through it, and I didn't hear a word out of her. And I looked to my left, and her face was covered with tears. And I stopped and I said, you just wanted me to hold this poem. I apologize. And I think it said a lot. She could have really let me have it like she should have, but also how fragile she was. And yet fragile, the intensity in that poem. And I thought it just said a lot of her as a person. And I just want to share that little vignette about Lee.
Thank you, Glenn. That's a great one. We've got a couple comments that I'll read out too. Helen says, I love the way Lee used the metaphors of her religion without apology. Very meaningful. And Carl Little wrote, I'm remembering Marion Stocking too, and Kate Barnes and Connie Hunting and Jeff Plunkett and other wonderful mentors. Yeah, there's a whole line of folks who mentored so many people and poets over the years. And
Where's my mouse? Sorry.
okay. Does anyone else want to jump in here with something before we sign off? I'd like to just remind folks that this book is jaw-droppingly gorgeous. And so I would say get yourself a copy. Kelly's Books to Go, and support an independent bookseller, and also a wonderful press in Tupelo who champion Lee's work. So I think unless there's somebody else who wants to jump in here, I think we can call it a night. I want to thank everybody again for those amazing readings, those lovely words, and it's really great to be with all of you tonight. Thank you. Take care.